Hi, boys and girls. It's Miss Manning. Today we are going to be working on lesson 13, where we finish up Operation Clean Sweep. Our main focus today is to learn how to determine the meaning of the words or phrases as they're used in the text. So first we have to find those words or phrases in the text, but then it says explicit content in the text. That's what we're going to use to determine it. And that's just a fancy way of saying we need some text evidence, some stuff around the word that helps us determine it. And then also, we're going to be looking at some figurative language and determine the meaning of the figurative language, whether it's from our knowledge of figurative language or from text evidence to help us determine. So first, let's talk about figurative language. I have two examples, and we're going to start with similes and metaphors. These are the two that are used most common and are sometimes simile, especially, is the easiest to identify. But you're just looking at comparing two or more things. Whether you're doing it with a simile or you're doing it with a metaphor, you're comparing two or more things. When you're comparing for a simile, you're going to see the word like or as. So let's look at some examples. My first sentence, Adrian was as cool as a cucumber. So I have to compare two things. And in that sentence, I'm comparing Adrian to a cucumber. But does the sentence mean that she's cool? Like she's snapping her fingers saying, oh yeah? That's obviously not what cool as a cucumber means. So we have to figure out then from the words around it, what the author is trying to tell us. My next sentence, Melinda was sly like a fox. So I'm comparing Melinda to a fox, but do I mean that she is like this fox in this picture trying to steal an egg? I don't literally mean that. I'm trying to say something about Melinda. So the key is while I'm comparing Adrian to a cucumber, I use the word as here. When I try to compare Melinda to a fox, I use the word like. So now let's look at some examples of comparing two things without like or as. So I have first, Adrian was a big baby. So I'm comparing Adrian to a baby, but I don't actually mean that she is a giant baby, like from Boss Baby. I mean that she's just not acting her age or she's throwing a fit. Then we have Melinda was a big chicken. So I'm comparing Melinda in this sentence to a chicken. But do I actually mean that she's a giant chicken? No, I mean that she's being scared. So sometimes figurative language can help us say something in a more interesting way, a way to engage your readers. And sometimes it's the easiest way to explain something um, using that figurative language. It's way easier for me to say that Melinda was a big chicken than for me to say Melinda's palms were sweating. Melinda wouldn't go into the room. Melinda got scared when I showed her the grasshopper, or whatever it was. It's so much easier with figurative language and it's better to read. It's more entertaining. So let's look at some more examples. We have personification. That's just when you're giving an inanimate object characteristics of a person. Another common one could be an animal. You could give an animal characteristics of a person. But we have that word person there. You're giving him human characteristics, but personification has the word person in it. So it's the easiest one to kind of remember. So let's look at some examples of that. The moon was resting in the midnight sky. So the moon would be our inanimate object, and the moon doesn't actually need to rest. It's just a very pretty way of basically saying it's sitting in the sky. The other one is the leaves dancing their way through the lawn. So what I know is they're just telling me the leaves are blowing in the wind, but it sounds so much prettier and it creates this mental image when we think of them dancing through the lawn. Then we have onomatopoeia. This one's a really fun one to say, and it's also a very fun one to use in writing and to read about. It's just when the words imitate the sounds that they make, like boom or splash. It just when you see those words or you read those words, you can hear it in your head. You can hear the words in your head as you're reading them. Then we have a hyperbole. It's just exaggeration to make a point. It's one of my favorite ones to use when I am writing. It's also like I think of Junie B. Jones was really good at hyperbole. She would exaggerate everything. So examples, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. We're not obviously going to be eating horses. It just means you're really, really hungry. Or I have 1,000 things to do. Sometimes, especially with remote learning, we might feel like that, but we don't actually have 1,000 things to do. But when you say that to someone, they just know that you feel like you have a bunch of things to get done. And then we have idioms, which are just common phrases that can't be taken literally. And these are ones that you tend to have to be exposed to understand them, but you can use the context around what is being said to figure it out. So, a pretty common one is piece of cake. If you said this math test was a piece of cake, you don't actually mean that your teacher passed out cake, although that would be delightful. You just mean that it's easy. So, it's not literal, but we know, we understand what somebody's saying it's a piece of cake means. Another example is raining cats and dogs. There's not really cats and dogs falling from the sky when somebody says that. It just means that it's raining really hard. So, in our story, we are going to come across this phrase, brightly polished. So, when we're reading, it says that mom had seen to it that we were all fed, brightly polished, and packed into our auto. So, they're talking about getting in the car on the way to um, the votes being counted and the voting and all of that. But they don't mean that the mom actually polished the kids like with a buffer or anything like that. It just means the mom made sure that they were dressed nice and clean. They had their hair brushed. They looked presentable. So that's kind of some figurative language, an idiom that says she didn't actually do this. It means that she really just got the kids ready for school or for the voting. While we are reading pages 75 through 77, I want you to answer the question, why did Flora wink at Corn when the votes were being tallied? So pay attention for that moment in our story. Corn, are you ready? We've got to leave in 10 minutes, Mom called up the stairs bright and early on election morning. Bacon popped in the skittle, and water whistled in the kettle. Mom was pinning on her hat in the kitchen mirror. Dad was standing right next to her, saying, "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen," and striking different poses. "How's this look, Corn?" He held in his stomach and turned sideways. I stared at him. "What are you doing?" "I'm practicing my acceptance speech," he replied, watching himself in the mirror. "And so it is with great gratitude, Flora, honey, should I say great gratitude or much gratitude?" "Either is fine, Frank." "And so it is with great gratitude that I accept another term in office as mayor of this fine city." He held his hands out, palms up, as though testing for rain. In a matter of minutes, Mom had seen to it that we were all fed, brightly polished, and packed into our auto. Dad had decorated it with red ribbons and flags. On the on both back windows were posters that said Sandwick for mayor, the wise choice. You think our moms will go down in the history books and that kids will be reading about them 100 years from now? Otis said. I shrugged. We'll find out pretty soon. The voting booth closes in 10 minutes. In about 10 minutes. Those last 10 minutes were the longest 10 minutes of my life. More women came out smiling. More men came out smiling. I felt like wiping those smiles right off their faces. Didn't any of them know what I was going through? I bit my lip. I bit my fingernail. Heck, I bit everything I could get my teeth on, even the top button of my coat. When the booth closed, folks made their way back to Main Street and hung around in front of the post office while the votes were tallied. There was an eerie silence among women. Mom's eyes met mine, and she winked at me. I was so nervous I couldn't wink back. I couldn't do anything except for sit and wonder. And so, dear friends and citizens of Umatilla, I'm happy to represent this fine city of ours and serve as your next mayor, Mom said, and Dad was standing by her side. It is with utmost respect that I take up my responsibilities, as do the other 6 women who have been elected today. The crowd, which had gathered around the post office, seemed to be split down the middle. The women were clapping and cheering. The men were shaking their heads and looking as confused as Dad. "It's a joke," one man shouted. "That's what this is, isn't it? You women are playing a joke." Mom's lips tightened and her nose got that pointy look. "If I didn't think we could give this town the improvements it deserves, I'd be the first to step down from office. I promise you this, women or not, Umatilla is going to have the best government it's ever had." Another man shouted from the crowd, "How about you, Frank? What do you think of this petticoat coup?" Dad just stood there, his hair going in all directions. Well, I think it's a shock to all of us. He shook his head and put his arms around Mom, then motioned to the other elected women. All I have to say is never underestimate the power of a woman. So we have a vocabulary word tallied. The sentence is when the booths closed, folks made their way back to Main Street and hung around in front of the post office while the votes were tallied. So normally this would be a word that we would have to explain to kids that they're counting the votes. But with the current presidential election, I feel like you guys all understand the idea of counting votes and how they're talking about them being tallied. Our next vocabulary word is underestimate. All I have to say is never underestimate the power of a woman. And that's a compound word. We have the word under and estimate. So if you're estimating something, it's just talking about your guess. But if we're underestimating, we're going low. So he's saying, don't count women out. Don't think that they can't do something. All right, so the author tells us that the car is decorated and it says Sandwick for mayor, the wise choice. So, what candidates have the last name Sandwick? Well, we have the mom, Flora, and then the dad, Frank. Both, they're married, so they both have the last name Sandwick. So, how is the outcome of the election contrary to what Frank expected? So, we have to think back to when we started, and dad was sitting there practicing his acceptance speech. He had won mayor many times and expected that he would, in fact, get it. But the author includes the fact that their car has these posters on the back of it, their auto, as they call it, as a moment of irony. This moment where actually Flora, she's still Sandwick, and she's the mayor now. So Flora is in fact the mayor with the same last name. That was his campaign poster that was back there for dad, and it ended up being his wife who won it. But really, that was still a campaign poster for his wife as well. So it was this moment of irony that the author chose to include for the readers. On page 77, Flora gives her acceptance speech. So, what does the author mean by saying that the crowd seemed to be split down the middle? So, this would be a piece of figurative language. And if you would like to determine the figurative language, that's fine. But we actually don't need to know if it's a metaphor or an idiom or a hyperbole. We need to know what what the author's trying to tell us. So, I want you to look through for text evidence of how you know what he means by the crowd was seemed to be split down the middle. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. I will see you again tomorrow where we compare our two stories that we've read. Bye, guys.